and to me also very important, even because it's the first book I wrote, so it's also a new thing to present the book in this way. As said before, Introduction to Comparative Planetology is published by Strelka Press, and what you're going to hear now is a kind of short teaser, half-an-hour teaser for the book itself. And if you don't mind, I will jump right into the argument. Because if you think about that, as recently, for example, also noted by Bruno Latour in his Down-to-Earth manifesto, today it becomes abundantly clear that climate crisis is not simply a political problem. It is, properly speaking, a kind of geopolitical affair, since it transcends nation-state boundaries, both in its causes and in its effects. However, as we have repeatedly seen since Rio 1992, and even despite Paris 2015, attempts to coordinate climate emergency mitigation do not reach any kind of satisfactory result. The most recent conferences, such as Katowice 2018, or the UN Climate Action Summit in New York last September, or the ongoing Madrid Climate Summit, just underscore this sad tendency. And to better illustrate these failures, we might observe an alarming trend of climate injustice as a result of the geopolitical climate appeasement, because it is exactly countries of Oceania, of Africa, of Southeast Asia or Latin America that are the first frontal line of climate emergency. While Western countries, as well as India and China, are hesitant to take a lead in global action against runaway global heating. And seeing this kind of space of geopolitical climate failures, it might be time to reconsider whether the geopolitical dimension of climate crisis should not be rendered anew. This can mean, among other things, to reassess the role of nation states as sovereign actors of ecological geopolitics, given that the hollowing out of their functions in the last 40 years of violent neoliberalization has led to a situation in which they lack the instruments for planetary coordination. So how should the climate crisis be perceived outside of the geopolitical space of nation states? One of the alternative geopolitical spaces is the infrastructure space, since any kind of truly planetary coordination and also any kind of collective orchestration of human and non-human actors requires an infrastructural power. Why? Because infrastructures are capable to facilitate and standardize tendencies and regimes of engagement between bodies in space. And there are many examples of such infrastructures. Of course, postal address systems, languages, scripts, transoceanic cables, calendars, time zones, sewage systems, broadband, water pipes, websites, cloud platforms, or distributed ledgers. To mobilize this kind of infrastructural power in relation to climate emergency mitigation, we need, however, to understand first anew what is the geo in geopolitical, which means, at the first place, to abandon the Westphalian conditions that give rise to the situation of globalization. Under these conditions, nation states are treated as subjects of global action, yet they are actually losing the capacity to control global affairs, and infrastructures are seen as shady mechanisms in the background of geopolitics. So we need to flip the figure and the background and recognize infrastructures as one of the major planetary agencies we have at our disposal, since they can intervene there where nation states alone fail. But before doing so, we must make clear what actually is the object we aim to save from runaway climate catastrophe. That is what we talk about when we talk about the planet. And that is exactly the business of comparative planetology as a philosophical genre. Kim Stanley Robinson, an American science fiction writer, characterized comparative planetology as a science that compares different celestial bodies in terms of the composition of their atmosphere or soil, in terms of geological and geophysical processes, volcanic activities, and so on. In my account, comparative planetology is something different. It is a philosophical genre, not an exact empirical science. It studies different visual and different philosophical cultures of imagining our planet. What is important, comparative planetology maps these cultures and imaginations into a geopolitical realm, because different imaginations of the planet reflect different geopolitical arrangements. And these geopolitical spaces are then crucially translated into different geophysical and biochemical realities on the planetary scale. As an example, take the following situation. When the European Union at the beginning of September 2019 considered declaring a potential no-deal Brexit a major natural disaster, it made perhaps unwittingly a gesture towards understanding this transition of geopolitics into chemistry and vice versa. To explain, the socio-economic consequences of Britain leaving the EU are also a kind of planetary chemical event, just as the trade war between China and the US or a looming conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia. In all these cases, the slowdown of, for example, international trade affected by such events can be mapped into relative fluctuations in CO2 emissions of these states or in resource extraction, such as minerals, oil, gas, and so on. Comparative planetology thus allows us to ask some questions, such as, for what Earth do we design? Or what geopolitical tendencies does our imagination of Earth endorse? By doing so, comparative planetology contributes to an emergence of a solid theoretical conceptualization of the planet in contemporary thinking about politics, media, design, or architecture. Because we increasingly refer to terms like planetary entanglements, planetary coordination, planetary conditions, planetary ecosystem, planetary scale computation, planetary megacities, and so on. But closely scrutinized, we discover how these rhetorical gestures might in some cases turn out to be vacuous, especially once they turn into common currency in intellectual cultures. And here it is the task of philosophy to elaborate on the conceptual underpinnings of this emerging discourse. However, why turn the question of what the planet means today into a philosophical problem? There are two ways to answer this question. The first one is based on an observation of Czech philosopher Jan Patočka, who claimed that the problem of philosophy is the world as a wall. And it is exactly this thinking about the world as a wall that in the situation of climate emergency becomes an inquiry into the conditions of our planetary existence. This means that today the world as a wall is the planet. The second justification of comparative planetology and the place of philosophy as a geopolitical tool comes from Carl Schmitt. Schmitt claimed that geopolitics is possible only after the figure of the Earth as a wall becomes at the site of legal spatial ordering. Thus, one can claim that geopolitics is always in need of the figure of the wall, or in need of some planetary imagination, and philosophy as a discipline has the means to deliver it. That brings me to the clarification of what comparative planetology actually compares. Different visual and philosophical imaginations of the planet are in comparative planetology clustered into coherent figures, and these figures are 5 in comparative planetology in the book: the planetary, the globe, the terrestrial, Earth without us, and spectral Earth. In the rest of this teaser lecture, I will clarify now these figures, and I will highlight 1 or 2 key moments of each of these planetary imaginations. So to start, the central figure of comparative planetology is that of the planetary. It is an imagination of the Earth as an impersonal geophysical process in which humans play the role of temporary mediators. This figure can be approached from 2 perspectives: Earth system perspective and critical subjective perspective. Earth system perspective looks at the planet as a process where inorganic objects, biological species, as well as geographical territories are treated equally as media for torrential forces, packing and unpacking themselves on various scales. As William Connolly remarks in relation to the human position in this cascade of complex planetary processes, we are inhabited by forces of the world, or perhaps even occupied by forces of the world, rather than being its primary subjects and masters. As humans, we are delicate and ephemeral beings, just as the Earth itself, seen from the vantage point of cosmic history. This understanding of the human as a temporary medium brings me to the second critical subjective perspective on the planetary. This perspective is best represented by Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak. In her reading, the planetary brings gestures of disenchantment and the defamiliarization of the home. While Connolly talks about humanity inhabited by forces of the world, Spivak thinks about the planet as an alterity, as something genuinely outside of the human. As she says, if we imagine ourselves as planetary accidents rather than global agents, planetary creatures rather than global entities, alterity remains something underived from us. It is not our dialectical negation. It contains us as much as it flings us away. And one can spot here the kind of existence of alterity as exteriority, something external, exteriority. And this idea of exteriority is crucial to understand the argument of comparative planetology, because this alterity exteriority manifests itself as a procedure of the unfolding of path dependencies that were here before humans and that can very well continue after the end of the species. With this idea of exteriority now in mind, let's explore now the second figure of comparative planetology, that of the globe. The globe is defined as a juxtaposition to the planetary. It provides a kind of conceptual genealogy of a Westphalian geopolitics of nation-states and presents a provisional history of some Western misconceptions about the planet, driven by colonial expansion of European countries from early modernity onwards. So the history of the globe is closely associated with this darker side of Western modernity, as Walter Mignolo would say, that is the coloniality. And there are two key moments of the figure of the globe. The first one is the imagination of the world as a smooth, divisible terrain. Its birth can be associated with early cartographical gestures of modernity, such as an intervention of the Pope Alexander VI in 1493, who, speaking on behalf of an almighty observer of the world from above, that is the God, resolved territorial disputes between Portugal and Spain as the two early colonial powers by drawing a line on the surface of the earth, dividing it into two hemispheres, one belonging to Portugal and the other to Spain. And what begins with one papal gesture ends with global logistical networks. The establishment of the omnidirectional space, of the smooth space of modernity, is closely associated with sea transport, and the ocean seascape becomes in this sense the spatial template of the logistical regime of modernity. The container becomes the tool of the spatial abstraction, a geometrical metaphor for standardization of the commodity flows. Together with emergence of smooth space, the second moment of the globe is the imagination of the world as an interior, as observed by Peter Sloterdijk. It can be well illustrated on different architectural and popular appropriation of spherical structures, or in Adam Smith's parables about the free market as a giant, sheltered marketplace. This idea of, in German, Weltinnenraum, the world interior, secures also space for cosmopolitanism and for interiorization of nature and culture. In relation to climate emergency, Sloterdijk shows how the metaphor of the world as an interior finds its ultimate realization in the overheated hothouse of modernity. And for this reason, modernity appears to be something like a giant march of interiorization that consumes the planetary reality in human affairs. Hence, while the planetary stands for the figure of exteriority or alterity, the globe is a colonial imagination of the world as a unified, homogeneous wall. It is a figure of interiority. This dichotomy is then invaded by the third figure of comparative planetology that attempts to bring solutions to the integral failures of the globe, and this figure is the terrestrial. Since the end of the Cold War, the universalist ideas carried by the figure of the globe have been substantially questioned by many political approaches. Those older than me surely remember, for example, anti-globalist protests culminating at the turn of the millennium with the Battle for Seattle, or marches against the meeting of the International Monetary Fund in Prague, or more recently in Hamburg during G20 protests in 2017. But going back to the turn of millennium, since that time, the anti-globalist agenda has kind of run out of steam on the popular left, and it has become the banner of post-fascism and far-right. These tendencies significantly decrease any prospect of planetary cooperation, since they complicate political geography by preferring fragmentation over integration. There are, of course, also progressive localist responses to the globe, such as Bruno Latour's understanding of the terrestrial, but for the sake of the brevity, I will focus only on the far right here. A perfect example of an appeal to geopolitical multipolarization is Alexandre Dugin and his right-wing interpretation of Russian Eurasianism. The Atlantic model of the globe, the model of naval empire, or if you will, the model of the eternal Carthage, is juxtaposed in Dugin's thinking by the Eurasian model, the model of the eternal Rome, the empire of the land, grounded in local blood and soil. What is important in Dugin's theory, despite his repudiating political commitments and shallow eclecticism, is how his critique of the globe can be actually aligned with those critiques that can be found in Latour or Sloterdijk. My suggestion is that both the relocalizing and multipolarizing tendencies, as well as late modernist resuscitations of the globalism, are actually different versions of the same appeal to the space of interiority. That is, the space that we can be intimately familiar with and that can be unified or divided without any friction. So that's a kind of situation where interiority can be taken as a space of culture or a space of a nation. And the only exception from this appeal to interiority seems to be Gayatri Spivak. Now, what I am really interested in is how to build geopolitics around the principle of exteriority or alterity, that is not as something we can be intimately familiar with. The question thus is, what kind of planetary imagination can reverse these interiorizing tendencies of modernity, that is, tendencies that result either in colonial globality or fragmented terrestriality? Can the principle of exteriority bring a promise of non-modern geopolitics? My suggestion is to begin this exploration with some new figures of the planet. In Comparative Planetology, I propose two such figures. The first is Earth without us. Briefly, Earth without us is the figure of a radically indifferent Earth. This monster Earth is best described by Gayatri Spivak when she claims that the planet gives a damn. It is in the rules of the galaxy and the planetary system, and we cannot touch it. The Earth without us is thus some kind of dark, creative, non-organic, inhuman Earth, an Earth that always, in principle, exists without us. We are just temporary symptoms of its deep geological and evolutionary processes. In this sense, Earth without us is a kind of radical conclusion of the figure of the planetary we have encountered earlier. And finally, the last figure of comparative planetology is Spectral Earth. It is a shadow realm populated by the spectra of extinct species. Thus, it is also a kind of Earth without us. Hence, Spectral Earth is neither a world to win nor to save. It is a world to be mourned. As natural sciences tell us, every known biological species comes with an expiration date, and Homo sapiens is no exception. The problem is thus not so much whether we will become extinct, but how we will cope with the truth of that extinction, and subsequently how we will design for extinction. Some authors believe that we are already living our own extinction in this way. One of them is Marina Garcés, Spanish thinker. Rather than speaking about the post-human, she prefers to talk about a posthumous condition, conditio posthuma. Such a situation might be assessed by some as a reason for pessimism and defeatism, yet it would be misleading, since there is no reason to associate human centrality and human importance in the planetary assemblage with hope and optimism, or the decentering of the human with nostalgia, melancholy, and defeat. On contrary, conditio posthuma carries the possibility of living with the truth of extinction, that is, living with the spectre of the future death of the species. Spectral Earth thus allows us to see ourselves as ephemeral elements of planetary metabolism, arriving at a variation of what is by some thinkers called an outside view on ourselves. This outside view on ourselves is central to the geopolitics of 21st century. It brings a moment of productive alienation, an alienation when we see our own image but we cannot recognize ourselves in it, as Ben Bratton would say. Or as Holly Herndon says, we are completely outside ourselves and the world is completely inside us. Instead of governing the landscape, we arrive at the possibility of becoming a kind of landscape. And here one can refer, for example, to recent essays by a writer, Elvia Wilk. Camouflage, together with dislocation and decentralization, rather than hypervisibility, might be a better guiding principle in this pursuit. After all, the picture of Spectral Earth is not that different from Dark Forest of Liu Cixin's novels, a place where it is better not to let others know about your existence too much, since it may cost you a mass extinction event. We need less geoengineering and more geopoetics in this sense. That brings me to a very quick conclusion. Let me return to the claim that comparative planetology allows to ask questions such as, for what Earth do we design? In this respect, design becomes a geopolitical as well as geopoetical tool, and it matters really a lot whether we design for another smooth sphere of the globe, or whether we design for fragmented, localized planet of the terrestrial, or whether we design from the vantage point of the planetary towards an unknown Earth without us, with the haunting spectral Earth always in mind. Now, it might be a good time to come back to the notion of infrastructural geopolitics of climate emergency. The geopolitical argument of comparative planetology can be labeled to some extent as anarchist, to the extent to which it brackets off state sovereignty. And talking about infrastructural space, we should always be prepared to tackle the question that necessarily arises once we exempt nation states from geopolitical affairs, since nation states are still understood as typical spaces of democracy. And the question then is, are we not running towards an authoritarian means of climate emergency mitigation? I guess no, since nation states are a historically contingent form of democratic community. The ancient Greek polis was the political community assembled within one city. The Roman political community was defined by belonging to an empire. The Pachamama of the Peruvian Quechua people brings all species into such a community. With respect to climate emergency geopolitics, the figure of Earth without us and Spectral Earth allow comparative planetology to read the planet itself as an infrastructural space. And thus, while states are polities of human subjects, at least in theory, there is no humanity presumed in the polity induced by infrastructural space. Hence, the kind of inhumanism that is associated with the figure of the Earth without us can find its geopolitical articulation in politics of usership. Politics of usership replaces emphasis on ownership in contemporary political economy. It moves towards a framework when use or delegation of use of a given resource is not conditioned by owning the resource, but by belonging to the collective of users, which communally maintain the distribution or access to the resource. In this respect, we can also think about technical species that can decide with us and on our behalf. The coordination of climate emergency mitigation asks for the mixing in uneven proportions different modalities of intelligence. This might mean a redistribution of epistemic competencies concerning planetary affairs. For example, human-made artificial intelligence can tap into planetary ecosystem intelligence in order to contribute to non-state governance of interventions against the runaway climate crisis. So if artificial intelligence is geopolitical as well as geochemical technology, our understanding of genres of intelligence might inform our co-curating of the planetary destiny, And there is so much to unpack in the book, because this conclusion is only one of the 5 conclusions that are in the book. And I always change this conclusion based on the venue when I'm actually doing it and the kind of audience that comes. So I hope this was a good conclusion for this brief talk. And thanks for your attention. And I'm looking forward to enjoy the discussion afterwards. Thanks.
So, oh, that's loud. We will take a 10-minute break and then we will continue with a conversation and discussion between Kia and Lukáš.